This morning we're going to be looking at a longer passage from the book of Exodus. We're going to look at all of chapter 8, and so that's going to take us through the next 3 plagues that strike Egypt. And one of the things that we'll see is we're going to continue to see this pattern of Pharaoh hardening his heart against God. And so I was thinking about this week. One of the things that I thought about is there's this bit of dialogue in the book High Fidelity by Nick Hornby, and I will confess that I pulled this quote from the book, but I'm aware of it because of the John Cusack movie. But in the book High Fidelity, the narrator Rob, he presents us with really what is his sort of existential dilemma. This is the thing that is sort of driving him through the story. He asks the question, what came first, the music or the misery? People worry about kids playing with guns or watching violent videos, that some sort of culture of violence will take them over. Nobody worries about kids listening to thousands, literally thousands of songs about heartbreak, rejection, pain, misery, and loss. Did I listen to pop music because I was miserable, or was I miserable because I listened to pop music? And as the story unfolds, what we see in High Fidelity is that for Rob, the relationship between misery and pop music it really is more cyclical than a simple cause and effect. He finds comfort in these songs that express how he's feeling. And yet these same songs also condition and shape his heart. And so he retreats into this sort of performative misery which shelters him, but at the same time it isolates him from true, honest vulnerability. And so we see a cycle similar to this when we look at Pharaoh. It's not as simple as just mere cause and effect. I mean, God is sovereign, and he's already said that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. But we also see that Pharaoh, again and again and again, he chooses to harden himself against God. The plagues offer Pharaoh chance after chance after chance to turn back, to submit himself to the Lord. And yet at each opportunity, Pharaoh says, no. And so just as the plagues reveal the character and the glory of God, they also reveal the character and the defiance of Pharaoh. Now, because we have a longer passage this morning, we're going to break up the text and we're going to look at each plague before we consider the passage as a whole. Chapter 8 of Exodus is on page 50 in our Pew Bibles, or begins on page 50. And so what we're going to do is, as I said, we'll look at each plague, we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll kind of consider this whole passage after that. But the end of Exodus 7, it tells us that it's been a week since the Nile was turned to blood. Now we can only imagine what a long and miserable week that must have been. The source of life for Egypt has been overwhelmed with the stench of death. And so Pharaoh's had plenty of time to think about his situation. He's had plenty of time to think about whether or not he wants this suffering to end or if he wants it to continue. And so now let's look together at Exodus chapter 8, verses 1 to 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord says, let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom and onto your bed and into the houses of your officials and on your people and into your ovens and kneading troughs. The frogs will come up on you and your people and all your officials.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the streams and canals and ponds, and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt.' And so Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land. But the magicians did the same things by their secret arts. They also made frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, 'Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord.' Moses said to Pharaoh, 'I leave to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile. Tomorrow, Pharaoh said. Moses replied, "It will be as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs will leave you and your houses, your officials and your people. They will remain only in the Nile." After Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord about the frogs he had brought on Pharaoh. And the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Now, when we think about these plagues, I think sometimes it's hard for us to really imagine the reality, the terror, just the awfulness of them, and what it must have been like. And the only thing that I've experienced that even gives me a little bit of a glimpse into this is what it's like to be in a place that is infested with something. I mean, if you've ever experienced an infestation, then you have a bit of an insight into how awful a plague of something can be. We think about a plague of frogs, and I think most of us think that frogs are pretty cute. I mean, how bad could frogs be? But it's the scale. It's the scale of the plague that is really the problem. So I went to seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, and before Liz and I moved to St. Louis from Tennessee, we had sold our house in Tennessee, and we were planning to buy a house in St. Louis, and so we went up for a long weekend to do a house hunting trip, and we looked at all kinds of houses. And I think I've told you guys before, I used to be a carpenter, so I wasn't afraid to look at some pretty dodgy houses that maybe we could fix up. And so we went into a particularly dodgy house, opened the front door, and as soon as we opened the front door, there was just this overpowering smell of cat pee. And we walked in, we walked into the living room, we kind of looked around. I mean, the carpet was stained, it was just covered in fur and dirt on top of the fur. And the walls were stained, it was mildewy. It was just, we just stood there in the living room thinking, do we dare go any further into this house? I mean, it can't possibly get any better. This is the first room, right? I mean, more hard living has probably happened further back in this house. And as we stand there considering whether we want to go any farther, my ankles just started to itch. And I reached down and I went to scratch my leg, and my legs were just covered in fleas. All over my shoes, all over my socks, up my legs. We just ran out of the house, out into the front yard. We're swatting and slapping. We're taking off our shoes and socks, fanning everything out, just trying to get all of these fleas off us. In a matter of seconds, just all over us. Right, and for the rest of the day, even after going and taking a long hot shower, the rest of the day, right, what do you feel? It just feels like there's something crawling on you. Now, multiply that to something the size of a frog. Maybe they're little tree frogs, maybe they're frogs like this, but they're not just in the carpet, right? They're everywhere, and you can't run outside and try to brush them off because they're outside too. And you can't take a shower or a bath and try to wash them away because they're in your tub. Verse 3 says that the frogs were in people's beds and in their ovens and in their kneading bowls. You can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't do anything without being completely covered in frogs. Frogs that have just come up out of the Nile, so they're slimy and they're sticky and they're smelly and they're on everything. And so once again, Pharaoh turns to his magicians, and they're able to replicate this phenomenon. And this seems to be the exact opposite of what Pharaoh wants in this moment. Think about it. If you've been overwhelmed by a plague of frogs, the last thing you want is more frogs, right? He turns to his magicians, and they're like, yeah, we can make more frogs. He's like, I don't want more frogs. No more frogs. And so here we see the futility of the magicians and their secret arts. It makes it clear. Sorry, my coffee got kicked over. um, we see the futility of the magicians. It's made abundantly clear that Pharaoh's kind of had enough of this, because as soon as this happens, he goes and he pleads with Moses. He's like, all right, I don't need more frogs. I need no frogs. Like, Moses, can you please help me? He calls out to Moses and Aaron, pleads with them, and they take the frogs away. The plague ends, and as soon as there's relief from the frogs, Pharaoh hardens his heart. Right? He goes back on his word, just as the Lord said he would. And so then God sends the third plague. This is Exodus 8:16-19. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the ground. And throughout the land of Egypt, the dust will become gnats. They did this, and when Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff and struck the dust of the ground, gnats came on people and animals. All the dust throughout the land of Egypt became gnats. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. Since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere, the magician said to Pharaoh, This is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord had said. So as we consider this next plague, again, the scale is really going to be a thing that's hard for us to imagine. I just mentioned earlier, I used to work in construction, and I can tell you that I think one of the worst jobs that I ever had to do in construction was sanding drywall. And so drywall, if you don't know what that is, that's sort of plasterboard that covers walls and ceilings in most buildings and houses. And then the joints between the drywall have to be covered in sort of this mud, sort of this plaster mud. And then it has to be sanded smooth. So when it's done, it just looks like one solid sheet. You don't see the cracks or the joints. And so when you're sanding drywall, particularly in a new house, right? I mean, that dust is just everywhere, right? You're having to sand over your head, and it's just on everything. At the end of the day, it's just all over your body. It's in your hair, and it's in your ears. It's under your fingernails. It's on your lips. If you lick your lips, you taste it. At the end of the day, when you blow your nose, you're making mud with like the plaster dust and your snot, this white goopy mud. Now imagine that just all over your body, every little tiny bit of your body. Imagine that dust are gnats, just little tiny irritating little bugs. When Finn and I walked through the park this morning, there were some swarming around, and you do this as you walk through them, and that was just a few of them. And so they're everywhere, in everything. You're going to breathe them in and swallow them, right? So worse than the frogs, which are all over everything, right? These are tiny. Like, these aren't just going to be all over you. They're going to be inside you. You're going to breathe them in. You're going to try not to, but it's going to happen. I mean, it's overwhelming. It's gross. It's irritating. And here's the place where Pharaoh's magicians, they run out of tricks. Whatever dark magic they had been using to make blood and frogs, they can no longer imitate what the Lord is doing. And so they declare to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. Now, when we read that, we shouldn't really see that as a profession of faith by the magicians. They aren't necessarily saying that they believe in the God of Hebrews, that they believe in the power of Yahweh. They're basically just admitting their own limitations, right? Whatever dark magic they've been using, they've been calling on some sort of demonic supernatural power in the name of some Egyptian deity, and that has hit its limit. They can no longer steal or borrow from someone else's power. They say to Pharaoh, only a God could do this. And that's exactly the point that God is making. Moses said in verse 10 that God would respond so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. And so at this point, the magicians get it. None of the gods of Egypt, no other power that they could try to draw on or borrow from could do what God can do. They can't do what God has done. And still, Pharaoh isn't convinced. And so again, he hardens his heart. And so the Lord sends the fourth plague. Exodus 8, verses 20 to 32. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes to the river, and say to him, 'This is what the Lord says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people, and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies. Even the ground will be covered with them. But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. And the sign will occur tomorrow.' And the Lord did this. Dense swarms of flies poured into Pharaoh's palace and into the houses of his officials. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined by the flies. And then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, 'Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land.' But Moses said, 'That would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, will they not stone us? We must take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God as he commands.' Pharaoh said, 'I will let you go to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but you must not go very far off. Now pray for me.' Moses answered, 'As soon as I leave you, I will pray to the Lord, and tomorrow the flies will leave Pharaoh and his officials and his people. Only let Pharaoh be sure that he does not act deceitfully again by not letting the people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord.' And then Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did what Moses asked. The flies left Pharaoh and his officials and all his people. Not a fly remained. But this time also, Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go." So I think by now I've maybe done the best I can to try to help us imagine just the scale and the grossness of these plagues. The flies are going to be just as bad as the gnats, but they're bigger. It's going to be like watching, a video of people who live in Australia and they can't even do a news interview without flies just crawling all over their face. Only, multiple times worse. But here, God also does something different. See, up till now, the Hebrews have suffered the same plagues that the Egyptians have. Right? When the Nile was turned to blood, that affected everyone who lived in Egypt, including the Hebrews. The frogs were on everybody. The gnats were on everybody. And so these initial plagues, they remind us that the effects of sin in the world, they impact all of us. God's people suffer brokenness and loss just like everyone else does. We don't get exempted from suffering because we aren't exempt from sin. Right? We suffer the consequences of sin in the world because we contribute to the problem of sin in the world. But now, in order to show that God is in their midst, to show that he is with them, the Hebrews are going to be protected from this plague. The land of Goshen, where the Hebrews dwell, is going to be set apart, and no flies will enter into it. All of Egypt will see not only the power of God, but his salvation for his people. These plagues have shown us up till now that the Lord does have power over all creation. Frogs from the water, gnats from the dust, flies from the air, right? Water, earth, and air. The main spheres of creation, God is showing that he has power over all of them. These things declare the power of God over creation. They also show us a reversal of the created order. In Genesis 1:28, the Bible says that humanity is to have dominion over the earth and over everything that dwells in it, over every living thing. But in these plagues, we see that dominion, that control over creation is completely turned upside down. Humanity is overwhelmed by the creatures of the earth. The plagues have also been an indictment of Egypt's gods. The Nile, with its life-giving power, was made into a god and it was worshipped. And God shows that he has power over that. The fertility of the land, the fertility of the land that made Egypt such a great nation, that fertility was represented by a god who had the head of a frog. Pharaoh, and so that was really was made into a mockery by the plague of frogs. Pharaoh himself was considered a god over his people, and yet he's powerless to stop or change what's happening. In the face of the living God, all of these lesser gods are shown to be powerless and futile. And now God has another point to make. He isn't distant or far off. He's in the midst of his people. He is near. He's present with them. And this is where we get to really to the theme of my sermon this morning. What I think helps us to understand this passage as a whole is this question: what about tomorrow? See, back in verse 9, during the plague of frogs, Moses said to Pharaoh, hey, you tell me when. You say when, and I will ask God to bring it into the frogs. And Pharaoh said, tomorrow. Why tomorrow? I mean, the frogs are everywhere. It's bad. It's awful. Pharaoh turns to his guys, his magicians, and says, what can you do? And they're like, hey, we can make more frogs. And he's like, no. And Moses says, I'll take them away. When do you want them gone? Tomorrow. Like, why would he say tomorrow? There's a tension that we see in these plagues. There's this choice between obedience to God and an obligation, because God is the one who's ultimately in control. The power of God is on full display. His will is going to be done. It's not a matter of what or if, it's only a matter of when. And so to this question, Pharaoh says, tomorrow. So one of some of my favorite stories when I was little were the adventures of Frog and Toad. So they're a frog and a toad, and they're best friends. It is only a coincidence, I think, that there's a frog in this story, and we've been talking about frogs, because this isn't necessarily about the plague of frogs. But there's a story called Tomorrow. And in this story, Toad wakes up, and he says, I know, you love them. They're so great. So Toad wakes up and he says, drat. And he looks around and he says, this house is a mess. I have so much work to do. And then Frog comes by and he looks through the window and he says, Toad, you were right. It is a mess. And so Toad pulled the covers up over his head and he says, I will do it tomorrow. Today I will take life easy. So then Frog comes into his house and he looks around and he says, well, Toad, your pants and your jacket, pants meaning trousers, your pants and your jacket are lying on the floor. And then he looks around and he says, your kitchen sink is filled with dirty dishes. There's dust on your chairs. Your windows need scrubbing. Your plants need watering. Tomorrow, cried Frog. I'll do it all tomorrow. And then Toad sat on the edge of his bed. Blah, said Toad. I feel down in the dumps. Well, why? Asked Frog. I'm thinking about tomorrow. I'm thinking about all the many things that I will have to do. All right, do you want to take that back? Thanks. All right, so Toad he doesn't want to deal with life. He doesn't want to deal with the things he's responsible for. He just goes, I'll do it all tomorrow. My mom used to say, why do today what you can put off till tomorrow? And when we think about tomorrow in that way, tomorrow sort of, we can treat tomorrow like it's this distant horizon that's never going to come. It's this payment that's just never going to come due. That tomorrow is just always out there. It's always just out of reach. As the song says, tomorrow is always a day away. And that's what Pharaoh is thinking about. That's what he's hoping for. He wants tomorrow to be distant, this thing that's coming but never comes. It's a way of keeping obedience at arm's length. It's a begrudging compliance. Pharaoh wants the plagues to end, But he still wants to negotiate with God. He wants to keep his options open. He's hoping, maybe his magicians are going to figure something out and they're going to get it right, or something else is going to come along, or he's going to think of something. He's going to figure out how to make this end without having to trust the God of the Hebrews. Tomorrow is sort of this verbal agreement that says, okay, Moses, I'll let your God help. But Pharaoh is still looking for another way out. Even when he admits that he's powerless, he's still vying for control. For Pharaoh, tomorrow is distant because to him, God is distant. Tomorrow is unknowable because Pharaoh believes that God is unknowable. But for God, tomorrow means something else. In verse 23, God says, tomorrow this sign will happen. And what sign is it? It's the plague of flies, a sign of God's power and judgment, as the other plagues have been, but also a sign of his presence with his people, his deliverance of his people. When God says tomorrow, it's not, I'm just hoping tomorrow never comes, I'm just trying to put this off. When God says tomorrow, it's a promise. He's saying this will happen. When God says tomorrow, he says that it's a sign that he is near, that he is with his people. He's not far off. He's not a distant horizon. He's not something that's always just out of reach. God is near. He's in the midst of his people. Karen read this for us earlier from Matthew 6. Jesus says, don't be anxious about tomorrow. And why? Why should we not be anxious about tomorrow? Well, it's part of the reason that we also read from Lamentations chapter 3, because the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new when? Every morning. And then Hebrews 13:8 tells us that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So in other words, God is near. He keeps his promises. He's with his people. He's right here, right now, in our midst. God will show up tomorrow. He tells us again and again that he will. He will show up tomorrow. But we don't have to wait until tomorrow. We don't have to keep him at arm's length. We can trust him today. And so we started out this morning with this question from High Fidelity, right? Did I listen to pop music because I was miserable, or was I miserable because I listened to pop music? Is it what's the cause and effect? And the truth is that it is that cycle. It's the choices that we make that actually form and shape our character. And in turn, it's our character that determines our choices. That's what we see in Pharaoh, right? He keeps choosing to reject God, and the harder his heart becomes, the more he is set and unable to choose anything else. We see this to destructive effect in the patterns of addiction in our lives. That someone chooses something that they haven't done before, but at some point they choose to do it, and it slowly begins to take over their life. Even as they utter the words, I can quit whenever I want to, the sad reality is that they have freely chosen something that slowly and surely robs them of their freedom to quit or to change. Pharaoh hardens his heart because he doesn't want God to come near. But God is already near. God is always near. The plagues are a sign of God's judgment, but also his salvation. His judgment fell on Pharaoh and on Egypt, but his salvation came for his people. Those who he set apart by his own mercy, they were spared the plague of flies, and there's more coming for them. God is starting to show what he is going to do, not only what he is capable of doing, but what he will do for his people. And so the judgment of the plagues, it was temporary, it was awful, and it was overwhelming, and then God takes it away, and there will come another. But it pointed to something greater. It pointed to an ultimate judgment that would be poured out on Jesus when he went to the cross. All of the judgment of God, the wrath and the power of God, was ultimately going to be poured out on his own son. And in the same way, while the salvation of the Exodus was temporary, God's going to deliver his people and they're going to mess stuff up again. It pointed forward to something greater, to a salvation that would come to all of God's people through the resurrection of Jesus. So what about tomorrow? Is tomorrow something that's always just out of reach? Or is tomorrow an imminent reality? Something that is coming and will come and has already come? Will you, like Pharaoh, use tomorrow as an excuse to keep God at arm's length, saying, "Oh, I'll do it tomorrow"? Or will you hear from God? Will you hear from God himself that tomorrow is the assurance that he keeps his promises, that God can be trusted, that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow? Right? God will be here tomorrow, but God is here today, and he invites us to trust in him today. Please pray with me.